Ehud Olmert served as the 12th Prime Minister of Israel from 2006 to 2009, and before that as Cabinet Minister from 88 to 92, and then again from 2003 to 2006. He joins us now from Tel Aviv. Mr. Prime Minister, good to have you on the show. Benjamin Netanyahu has called this a needed democratic step. You, on the other hand, have said that Israel is heading into civil war. What exactly do you mean by that, sir?
Well, as you have mentioned before, a wide part of the Israeli population, I believe more than half of the Israeli population, is vehemently against these changes, and they think that this is an attempt to take over powers to the government that will shake the basic foundations of Israel as a democracy. And this is not something that the enlightened Israeli public opinion will tolerate. So what I said is that the opposition to this is so strong and is so emotional. And you may have heard that lots of combat pilots in the Israeli Air Force decided to stop their volunteer service in the Israeli Air Force, that leaders of the intelligence community in the state of Israel, which is known to be one of the most sophisticated intelligence in the world, also announced that they will stop their voluntary service. So there is a real serious crisis in the state of Israel, and I'm afraid that if this confrontation will carry on, it may lead to a certain type of civil disobedience and civil confrontation between different groups. And this is very dangerous.
I want to understand your position a little bit better, sir. Are you against this because of whom it is coming from and what it could possibly mean for them, or that it could, in the words of the Israeli Supreme Court, sort of expand the tyranny of the legislature?
I'm very much against this. Well, we don't call it a reform, we call it a pogrom. We think that, and I reflect the attitude of millions of Israelis, this will indeed expand the tyranny of the legislator over the Supreme Court. What will happen basically is that the government will remain without the highest body controlling possible illegal activities by the government. And one of the problems is that this present government is made up of people who are very, very strange and quite uncommon certainly not for a democracy like Israel. The minister who is in charge of national security is a convicted terrorist, was convicted by Israeli court several times in actions involved in terror. Now he is the Minister of National Security. The Minister of Finance, a member of the Defense Cabinet, was accused or was detained and was arrested for a period of time when he was found with lots of oil and gasoline trying to attack convoys of the Israeli military in the highways of Israel in opposition to government decisions in the past. So it's not only the nature of these changes, but also the makeup of this cabinet in the hands of the most irresponsible and reckless people that terrifies the public opinion in Israel.
Mr. Olmert.
And it triggered this opposition and protest.
Mr. Olmert, sorry for interrupting you. You mentioned the Interior Minister. You also mentioned the Finance Minister. But this judicial overhaul bill passes as Benjamin Netanyahu stands for trial himself on multiple counts, whether it's fraud, breach of trust, and bribery. Do you believe that Benjamin Netanyahu is a criminal and he shouldn't be holding office?
I don't think that it will be appropriate for me, in the middle of a court case, which is taking place now, to offer any opinion about the nature of these, of the indictment and the possible outcome of this. It remains to the court to decide, and I don't think that before a decision by court, we should incriminate and convict Netanyahu. I don't like him. I think that he is a very bad prime minister. I think that he supports the worst possible factions in the Israeli society. I think that his partners are messianic, radical, extremist, fundamentalists, Arab haters, and they are doing the opposite of what needs to be done in order to start up a process of reconciliation and negotiations with the Palestinians. But with regard to the outcome of the court case, it remains to be seen what the court will decide, and I have a full trust in the court of Israel.
Okay, I understand your position, sir, and I respect it. The Supreme Court has just announced that it will be reviewing the bill. I think that's scheduled to happen in September. Now, since the law would essentially limit their power, do you feel that the judges will be able to make an impartial decision? I mean, that is a conundrum, is it not, sir?
Yeah, it's a kind of a problem. But the Supreme Court is asked to decide by the petitioners that the process of legislation was against the procedures that was fixed by law. So the question is, the question which the Supreme Court needs to review is whether this is a law which contradicts or does not contradict the fundamental basis of the principles of democracy in the state of Israel. In the event that the Supreme Court will decide that the legislation was done improperly and that the principles that were adopted by the Israeli parliament are against the basic fundamental values of democracy as they were practiced in Israel for the last 75 years, then maybe this legislation will be removed. Only if it will be accepted, then the powers of the Supreme Court will be limited. So it's true that, on the other hand, one can say, that the Supreme Court needs to decide whether to give up some of its powers or not. But this has been put by the Knesset and by the government, and this is a trap, but a trap that the government is responsible for, and it can't argue that the Supreme Court is not allowed to pass an opinion about it.
Here's the risk that I see, sir. If the Supreme Court removes this legislation, as you just made a reference to, some of the country are going to say the country is going to go, I mean, you say a civil war, but they're going to say it's going to lead to a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, there will be a constitutional crisis, no doubt about it. But my prediction, it's hard to say right now what will be the possible consequences in terms of the reaction of certain factions in the Israeli public remains to be seen. But my feeling is that if there will be a constitutional crisis, then the gatekeepers or the leaders and the commanders of the different national bodies, the army, the secret service, the police, will have to decide whether they respond to the government orders or whether they follow the Supreme Court decisions. Yeah. And my prediction is that all of them will follow the Supreme Court and not the government.
That is a big problem that will be faced by many. Let's switch gears here, Mr. Prime Minister, and talk about foreign policy. Do you feel that this bill, if implemented, if not stricken down by the country's Supreme Court, will have an impact, a serious impact on Israel's relations with the United States? On Sunday, again, we saw President Biden publicly encourage Prime Minister Netanyahu to slow the reforms down.
Yes. Well, as you said correctly, I think that it became quite clear that President Biden has recommended Netanyahu to refrain from passing the legislation and rather try to achieve a national consensus, even if it will mean changing the nature of this legislation or postponing the process. I think that the fact that Netanyahu was not invited to the White House since his election, now 7 months ago, is rare, is unusual. When I was elected prime minister, on the night of election, I got a telephone call from the president and he said, please come over. I want to see you within 2-3 weeks, which I did. And this has been a tradition. I was not exception. This was the tradition of all the prime ministers in the past. This is the first time that it is explicitly made clear by the president and the White House that they don't want to invite Netanyahu at this time because they don't approve of his policies and his attitudes. And not only, by the way, on domestic matters. I think the fact that his government continues the settlement policy, and they have announced just recently that they will build hundreds new settlements and bring in 1 million settlers into the West Bank, is something that make the American government very upset. And not just the American government. I think every government that cares for the Middle East and every government that cares for trying to achieve something that will help both sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, reach an agreement, it is something that they can't tolerate and will not approve. And this will solicit very, very unpleasant reactions from many governments, including the US.
Let's talk about unpleasant reactions. And since we're talking about one of Israel's longstanding allies, the United States, let's talk about perhaps, quote unquote, Israel's enemies. Do you feel that the country is at risk from Iran or even Hezbollah because they see the country in an internal divide?
Look, I think that they will make a mistake if they will make a wrong interpretation from this divide as to whether it's worthwhile for them to attack Israel or the Hezbollah and by the way, they are not looking for excuses. Fact is that Hezbollah was attacking Israel many years ago, time and again, regardless of any outside circumstances which would have encouraged it. And they started a war with me, even though it is now, I think, well known that I was very forthcoming about a possible arrangement and agreement with the Palestinians, and I made every possible effort to reach an agreement. So I don't think that the enemies of Israel are looking for excuses. But if they will draw a conclusion that because of the divisions on domestic issues, which, by the way, do not at all bother the Iranians. Iran doesn't have a democracy. In Iran, there is not a question of the rights of the Supreme Court. The Ayatollah decides on everything, and if someone doesn't obey the Ayatollah, he is doomed, as you well know. So anyway, if they will reach a conclusion that because of this serious argument, very serious opposition to the government by a large part of the population, that Israel has been weakened militarily, they will make a tragic mistake for them. When it will come to face an outside enemy of the state of Israel, we will all be united. We will continue fighting amongst us afterwards or before. But if we will be challenged by either Hezbollah or the Iranians, oh, you know, God forbid, they will pay a terrible price. I don't suggest to them to try. I will remind you that in 2006, Nasrallah said after the war between us and them, that had he known 1% of what my reaction will be, he would have not started it. Yeah. So I want to remind him again, you better remember what you had to go through 17 years ago. Don't try.
Former Prime Minister, Mr. Ehud Olmert, thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you.